You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Elaine Chukan Brown. We'll talk to Elaine about their new book, Wine and More. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Elaine Chukan Brown is an author, journalist, sought-after speaker, consultant, and a champion of diversity and inclusion in the wine biz, along with their mentorship. Their footprint is global and their work is ubiquitous. Elaine currently covers the Napa Valley in Northeast Spain for wine enthusiasts, wrote a column for Decanter, was a contributing writer for Wine and Spirits, the executive editor US for JanceasRobinson.com, and contributed to both the Oxford Companion to Wine and the World Atlas of Wine. Elaine also focuses on California wine, leaning into the intersection of sustainability, climate action, and reducing gatekeeping in the wine industry. Elaine Chukan Brown's new book, The Wines of California, is now available from Academy du Vin Library. Welcome back to the Grape Nation, Elaine.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad to have time with you.
Yep, I'm looking forward. We are talking to Elaine remotely via our Zencastr app. Elaine, where are you right now?
I'm in Sonoma,
Okay,
California.
That's your home, right?
Yeah, well, I like to say I pay rent here because I'm traveling so much.
Well, that was kind of my next question. But before that, I mean, you've been there over a decade, 2012?
Yeah, I moved here in 2012, and it's now the place I've lived longest in my adulthood.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. That's good. You know, as you get older, you can't run around, you know.
Yeah, I know. I get tired now.
But you're going to explain because, you know, you and I have been talking about doing the podcast, and the question I want to ask you plays into that. I know you're out there supporting the book, but I also know that you're a prolific traveler. So tell me some of the other things you've been doing and where you've been.
Yeah, so about a week and a half ago, I was in Vietnam. I spent time both in Ho Chi Minh City, what used to be Saigon, and also Hanoi. And then I came back and was in Sonoma for about 5 days, just did 3 days in Seattle. And let's see, I'm on my way to... I'll go to Alaska to visit family in a week or so. And then in July, I actually go to Oxford.
Why Oxford in July?
Yeah, so there's this group, this international group that ended up starting a Pinot Noir symposium. What's unusual about it is that it's an academic conference. And so it's going to be basically a 3-day meetup with really serious wine lovers and academics into wine from all over the world. And they've asked me to give the opening keynote for it.
You know, I've read in the past, like Oxford had all these wine clubs.
Yes. Yeah.
All of that stuff. I guess, you know, big interest there, maybe a further extension, but that sounds pretty cool. But listen, you know, I follow you on social media and I see you everywhere all the time doing different things like keynotes, you know, sort of speaking as an expert. I mean, what are some of the other type of things, you know, that you do? I mean, you're basically called upon for anything.
Well, I think have this unusual background where, you know, I know about wine, of course. And, you know, I just wrote a book on California, but I've actually traveled and done immersive visits in a lot of different regions around the world. So on the wine side, there's that. But then, you know, I used to be an academic philosopher, and worked on all these other topics that kind of feed into how I interact with wine people and wine itself. And so that ends up broadening. At some point, people realized I could talk about more than just wine. And so now that's a lot of them want me to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you're lucky to sort of have that diversity because, the way wine has evolved, there's so much to talk about, and
Yeah.
you're equipped for that. Um, while we're on this, I tried to figure this out. I mean, I know there's a story. I'm trying to figure out when you had that recognition of wine or that understanding and how that moved you towards it becoming a profession. Is there a story there or a timeline?
Yeah, there's kind of a big wandering story, but I'll try to give bullet points to shorten it up a little bit.
All right.
So I, born and raised in Alaska and spent my time going back and forth between two areas. So my parents wanted us to be all together in a place where we could go to mainstream school. So we wintered in Anchorage. And then the summer third of the year, we were out on the western coast in Bristol Bay, where my mom is from, but also because my family commercial fishes for salmon. And Bristol Bay is the largest intact wild salmon run in the world. So I grew up out there and in Anchorage. And in Anchorage, there were a couple of restaurants that had wine lists, but it wasn't really a thing.
I would imagine.
Yeah, this is the 80s. There was a little bit of distribution, but not a lot. And if you
listen, you could take shots at Alaska, but I think in the 80s, a good part of the country was like that.
Yeah.
Omaha, Nebraska was probably no.
Yeah. Well, and also if you just think about the way that transportation worked at the time, it would take forever to get anything to Alaska. So you'd need to know people that were going to use it. So anyway, the point is I didn't grow up with wine, but I always had this sense that it was an admirable thing that smart people knew about and like it was culturally important. So I always had that in my head. And because I grew up in Alaska, I always felt like I was far away from everything interesting. And so this notion of like, what would it take for me to give myself a classical education? Like, what would it take for me to learn the things I don't have access to here in Alaska?
Right.
That was always in my mind. And somehow wine was on the list, but other things were first on the list. So then I ended up, once I graduated from high school, I just kind of started traveling and driving all over North America and moving around.
Before you went to school?
Yeah, I
took some time off?
I went to university right away and then decided to take some time off. So, and then when I turned 21, a friend gave me a bottle of wine for my birthday, and she was a smart person that did know about wine. And so it was this really nice bottle of Chianti. That's all I know. I don't know what, subzone it was in or who the producer or vintage or anything.
It wasn't that basket Chianti
stuff. No, right? It was
real Chianti.
Yeah. And I opened it and I was like, oh my God, this is good. Like it was a shock. I didn't know that I would think it was good. And then a little bit later, another friend took me out to dinner at a restaurant that had a really nice wine list, and they ordered a Premier Cru Burgundy.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And again, that's all I know because I didn't know enough to remember more at the time. And the thing about that wine was as soon as I put my nose in the glass, I got it. I was like, oh, this is why people are obsessed. Because the thing about Alaska, it's like it's all remote. Anchorage is apparently a city, but there's this way that, you're still surrounded by so-called wilderness. There's mountains in every direction. The water, it has the second biggest tidal range in the world. It's right there. So everything is intense. And there's paved roads, but in the winter you can barely drive them. Everything is intense and outside. And I'm in Alaska, so I'm like running around outside all the time. And when I'm in remote parts of the state, I would be alone a good amount of the time, just again, running around outside.
Right.
And the thing Alaska did have was a whole plethora of scents. Like I could smell my way around the landscape, and it would change with different types of weather events.
But
I
did you
guess.
connect that to wine at some point? Like having sort of a database of all these smells that you
Well, I initially, of course, I didn't know, but
No, yeah.
yeah. And it turns out my uncle was like this too. His nickname was Nose. And because he just went around smelling everything. And for me, it was like, oh, it frosted last night. Like, even if I hadn't seen the frost,
Right.
I could tell by the smell changing. And leaving Alaska, there wasn't, you don't have that experience in the city. You know, you can't like map your way around by smell to the same level of detail. And then suddenly in this Premier Cru Burgundy, there was so much going on just in the nose. All this detail and layers and complexity. And if I swirled, it changed. And, you know, so suddenly I had a kind of experience that resembled.
So that moment, I mean, that all happened. I mean, you still talk about it. So obviously it
That was,
was like a
well,
singular moment in that sense.
yeah. The funny thing is, that wasn't the becoming a professional moment, but that was the
No,
moment
but
where
an
I
awareness.
got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so after that, I was very open to wine. I didn't know anything about how to order or what to choose or anything like that. And then a few years later, uh, another friend of mine opened up a bottle of Irie Pinot Meunier.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and you know, it's a still red Pinot Meunier, which is unusual. There's only a few of those in the world, and this was an older vintage. And by then I was pretty familiar with wine, and I knew like basics about regions and stuff. And I smelled this wine, and I couldn't believe it. Like, I can't even describe it better than that. I smelled this wine, and I couldn't believe it. And by then I already understood wine can have a lot of complexity in the nose, but this wine, it was inexplicable to me. It was like fascinating and enthralling, and I needed to understand. And that's when I decided, oh my God, I'm gonna throw it all in and like see what I can make happen in wine.
It's crazy because, you know, I talk to a lot of people and not the exact story, but similar storyline. You know, people who really had no exposure or no interest, you know, they hook up with wine. You know, I think only a handful of things, art, music, maybe can move you like that.
Yeah.
And it's just funny how with you, it was, you know, the wine that really stuck. So as you kind of go forward in whatever your academics and all that, wine is always in the back of your mind.
Yeah, so it's
Go ahead.
always in there. Yeah.
When's the moment like, okay, I'm going to try to make a living in the wine profession?
Yeah, so when I was in academia, I just remember in grad school, if we had a visiting speaker or visiting professor or something like that, there would always be a moment when people in the department took that visitor out to dinner. And different grad students would be invited. It was kind of a big deal to be invited.
Right.
And there was always some professor there that knew how to read a wine list.
Right.
And from the very first time I got asked to go to one of these dinners, I noticed, oh, that person really knows how to read a wine list. And then like a couple weeks later, I go to another one, and I was like, oh, I'll just sit next to that person just to see. And sure enough, again, they were asked to order a bottle of wine. So I just started sitting next to him whenever we went out to dinner, and I kind of picked up basics of ordering a wine list. So during grad school, I was really curious, and I would, like, every bottle of wine I picked out, I would try to learn, what does Cremant mean? You know, and the things like that. And then I actually got a full-time faculty position, and all the things you're supposed to want in academia. And then the global financial crisis hit in 2008, and budgets started getting cut. And by 2011, the university I worked at was going through its like fourth multi-million-dollar budget cut. And it was already getting harder and harder to manage my schedule because workload cut, every time there's a budget cut, each individual's workload goes up essentially.
Sure.
And I was starting to get really tired, and I had this moment where I realized, okay, the only way I can manage my workload at this point as if I lower my own expectations of how I teach, and also of my research, and or I can quit. And now I'm apparently a little more grown up. I don't know, but maybe if I
Yeah.
was in that moment, I would think of it differently.
Yeah, you're
But
not stuck.
yeah,
You
but
could figure stuff out.
so at the time though, I felt like those were my two choices. I could either lower my standards or leave my job. And I spent time thinking about it, and I realized I wasn't willing to lower my
Well, I
standards.
think it was an option, not a real consideration,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And so I gave myself a year to get out gracefully. And then
Do you jump into the wine
well,
profession?
so I did, but I didn't realize it at the time. I that
What does
year
that mean?
I I didn't have all the longer term parts of academia to figure out, my like
Right.
what's my next book, which books am I reviewing, how do I design the next class, all that stuff. So I needed something else to focus on. And I was like, well, I've always been interested in wine. I'll just like start learning it more thoroughly. So I turned to wine and started treating it like I was in grad school again, except for wine, and on my doing it on my own. So I started tasting really seriously, like learning regions, learning grapes, starting to learn winemaking and farming stuff. And
But as a primary focus, like you were doing more of that than most other stuff? Like your head was down on that?
yeah. So the funny thing about the way that I was raised up in academia, at least, it was philosophy is weirdly very serious, not just because philosophy is serious, but there's this weird pressure when you're an academic philosopher that is hard to explain. It feels like if you fail, your worth is like you should just leave the country. It's very high pressure. And so
Or
when you're
why did you get into philosophy in the first place? So
well,
get the hell
because it
out of
was
the country, right?
yeah,
That's the way people
yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, when I was in grad school, I realized like I knew some of the most respected philosophers in the world, and I realized every single one of them had one hobby. They did their career and they had one hobby, or they had kids.
Ah,
And so
wine was
yeah, wine was my
suitably a hobby for you. Yeah.
Yeah, wine was my hobby. So I started so I was taking wine really seriously, and I was started a blog just because as an academic you have to produce work, right?
Right.
And other people judge it. It's like you produce work and you sort of it goes off into the world, and then you get feedback and you decide what to do next. And I was very used to that kind of process. So I started a blog just to have a place to put it, where it's like I'll produce work and I'll put it this place that I can't control, so to speak. But I never promoted my blog. I just needed an outlet there. But
Right.
it turned out some people found it, and in like the third week I had it, Kermit Lynch Wine reposted. I was doing illustrating my tasting notes rather than writing them, and that it turned out at the time that hadn't been done before, at least on the published side. And so the third week I happened to draw a review of a Kermit Lynch wine, and they reposted it and called it a new standard in wine reviews. And then like week 5, Eric Asimov listed it in his recommended reading. And then I got an email from China and another one from Australia. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? So I had actually,
I never came across that. That's amazing.
Yeah, without realizing it, I had started my wine career, but I didn't know that for quite a while. But
Well,
that was how, yeah, that was how
you mentioned Asimov, who, is a critic columnist. Were there other people? Were you looking at and reading other people's stuff, or was really in the early days where there wasn't that much stuff around?
Well, so this is like 2010, 2011. I started my blog in 2011, and then I like left my career and went into wine in 2012. There were some stuff online. There was
like Wine Berserkers and Parker's thing and all that. And a few people were doing it.
Yeah. And, Asimov had The Poor and
Right.
Decanter was online by then. A lot of the other newspapers weren't really,
No.
or they were like partially, but there were, it was the kind of late in the era of blogs. So there were, I ended up meeting some other bloggers, which is so funny. Like nobody talks about bloggers anymore, but bloggers were a big influence for a while.
Well, save that thought, because I think at the end of the first chapter, you talk about social media, and that kind of plays into where we would go with this. So we'll come back to that. So I want to leave it there because I want to kind of let people kind of follow you around and say, oh, wow, then what happened to Elaine? Um, so they could do a little more research into you by the book, which is not necessarily autobiographical. But I want to get into the book. So I know I kind of left you hanging cold.
Oh, it's fine. It's totally fine.
And no time restriction or whatever. I'd rather, I could follow that line, but I really, want to jump into the book. But I want people to know, from Alaska, no background, academic, philosophy, how you stumbled on the blog. And that is the foundation for, what the intro was, that you travel all over the world, all the people that I mentioned you work for. So, those blanks are filled in. But I think we're going to spend more than ample time on the book. It's called The Wines of California. It's published by Academy du Vin Library. You had worked with them before on a book on California with a terrific lineup of writers. I think you wrote 3 different chapters. This book came out recently, and it's available. And at the end of the show, we'll tell people where they can get it. To me, wine has always been more than like fermented juice in the glass.
Yeah.
I mean, at first it was like you hold it up, look at it, and it smells like this or that. To me, it's more about learning about, and doing the podcast kind of taught me, it's learning about the history, the people, the culture. Farming became a big deal. Place is important, and even more. And I, comment on this. I think that's really the basis, of the book in that sense. It's a book about wine, but boy, there's a lot more to wine than people know. You agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what's kept me interested in wine, all the extra stuff. Even from the beginning, I understood that I was excited that there were so many different kinds of things that connected to wine, which meant I could have one kind of line of study, which would be wine, but actually I'd be learning about climate and topography and geology and all these things and people. And that's what's kept me interested. And I think the truth is, I think if I hadn't taken up wine in that kind of complicated way, it would have become a loved background element of my life.
I agree, because I think that separates you, and I think books about wine, this book is different. I think that's important. What I'm curious is, when you were doing the first blogs, did you have any sense of what we're talking about now, or as you get further and further into wine, you realize, it's about all these things? Did you have a sense of that very early on?
I did, but without realizing it. Because again, like I did this like self-study version of learning about wine. Because the thing is, I'd done doctoral work in philosophy. The only way you get there is if you know how to do like research and study on your own. And then, and then grad school demands you get even better at it. So by the time I'd gotten through all my coursework and writing comps and stuff, this idea that, I can just pick a topic and go learn it. Like, of course I can, because so with wine, I was like, I can just pick a topic and go learn it. And so I created my own way of studying it and learning it and tasting it that I didn't come up through like the Court of Master Sommeliers or the Institute of Masters of Wine. I did go take some of their basic courses to make sure I was like on the right track and could communicate with wine people. But what I'm getting at is that from the beginning, I was already looking at cultural history and who were the founders
You
and
were
why
piqued
did
by
they
it.
do it
Yep.
and how does it affect identity. I just didn't realize at the time that wasn't necessarily the driving force for wine reviewers.
Right.
Yeah.
Which different then than now. But, thank God you didn't take the traditional route because, we could do a show about that, all the gatekeeping and just all the stuff that it has been. You kind of took your own path, which is, really important to this book and, how you view and you're viewed about wine. I got a couple of sort of general, backdropy questions. How would you describe the book and how do you want people to use it?
Yeah. So I tried to, I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, this is a Wines of California book. I have to serve the needs of that kind of regional look, right? So you have to have
But on whose dictate?
Well,
that's something you thought you should follow?
Well, I was like, yeah, there's a whole series, Wines of the Loire, Wines of Northern Spain.
Okay, so you're in that box to some extent.
Well, and so I was like, okay, there's a sense in which I need to include certain kinds of information. But I also was very aware we don't need another typical wine book.
Thank you.
Like if that's all this is, people can put it on their shelf as a reference, but never really carry it around. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about why would I even write a book? What would it mean for me to write a book? What does it mean for California to have a comprehensive book? I spent a lot of time thinking about all of that. And I decided that I needed to write a book that kind of respected the needs of or expectations for a wines of book. But at the same time, I had to write a book that only I could write, so that lots of people could write a Wines of California book. But the book I wrote, I approached wine in this unusual sort of way, like studying it from this outside perspective and looking at a lot of different aspects of it. And I was like, well, then that's what I need to write into the book is all these different ways.
So my next question, and when I put it together, I'm like, when people write a book, it's their book, it's their voice, but it isn't always that. I mean, to me, I think it's fair to say this book from page to, wire to wire was in your voice. I mean, I think, right?
Yeah.
That's what's important to me about this book, that it really is who you are and your voice.
I think at this, thank you for that. And also I wanted it to be useful beyond what I was interested in. So I kind of brought together these two goals, which was to write different sort of picture on California wine through which you could still get the kinds of information you need if you're a wine student or just want wine information. Right. So I sort of combined those two things, and I feel like the way I tried to pull it off at least was, okay, each history chapter starts with a timeline so you can see what dates are most important to it, and then each regional section has the AVAs there and like basic information like when it was founded and talks about the founders, and then in the very back there's appendices where, because it's like, okay, how is someone from Korea going to have any idea what an AVA, the American Appellation System, even is, or how they're determined? If
so that's why you have Europe. An extensive like appendix, where you could cross-reference everything.
Yeah, and also a glossary, because I realized if I'm writing a wine book in a way that's not just for wine students or scholars, then that means some non-wine people, so to speak, are going to read it. But who on earth that's not already into wine is going to know what ungrafted means?
Right.
So I created a glossary that hopefully helps that. And then if you're a serious wine student, there's these appendices that kind of, list and explain different sustainability certifications, the different ABAs of California, and like legal labeling and requirements and things like that.
Yeah, it's very extensive, and the nice thing is it's there, and there's not really anything you're going to read about where if you don't understand it, you can't cross-reference it in the book. The second thing I wanted to ask you, I call it the vitals. And then I want to get into the book, but the vitals are, how did this book come about? And why did you want to write it? That's question one. When did you start working on it? I know part of the answer. You've been doing the research on this book since you started talking about that blog, but you tell me more about that. And how long did it take to write? I mean, just get that stuff out of the way for me.
Yeah. So in 2019, I think it was 2018. I'm pretty sure it was 19. Classic Wine Library, which is the imprint that publishes these, wines of this place in the world books.
Right.
A Classic Wine Library contacted me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book on California. And I said, yeah, I think so, but let's talk about it. And so we talked back and forth, and I decided, okay, yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. At the time, though, I was thinking of it very much as like a wine reference type book. And, more of the obvious, like this is a collection of how to understand a region kind of thing. And
that was the overall concept?
Yeah, originally,
Boy.
And, here's the section where I'll talk about the geology of California, and
Cremigian stone or whatever.
Yeah. And so originally that was like what we talked about. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. But so then the pandemic happens, and, I'd been like mapping out what kind of information would be in this book. But the pandemic happened, and, suddenly we were all in a situation where you just had to work when you could. And so I was too busy and too stressed out to write at the time. So, and they knew it was a pandemic. So we agreed to kind of pause and extend the deadline. Then Classic Wine Library sold to Academy de Vin.
I wanted to know how that came about.
Yeah,
so that's why the two are together.
Yeah, so Academy de Vin bought Classic Wine Library. Rebecca Clare is a fantastic editor. She's been with Classic Wine Library all along and still is, thankfully. And and Hermione, who is like the leads Academy de Vin as a publisher, she's been really great to work with too. But what happened was then I had enough of a pause between when I started talking about this and then when I actually, needed to get it done. And also the publisher, the imprint was the same. The idea was the same. It's a Wines of California book. But at the same time, Academy de Vin was publishing books with a broader scope. And I decided, if I'm going to bother to write a wine book, it needs to be a book I would want to read too. Like it needs to give you useful information.
Right.
What do I want to read in a wine book?
But your belief set is now also different than, the ordinary and the common. And you wanted to integrate that, right?
Yeah. Because I was like, it isn't this is a 468 page book. It's a lot of work to write that much.
Yeah. No,
and I, after the pandemic, to be blunt, I was already no bullshit, pretty direct person. I'm from Alaska. That's how you survive up there.
Right.
The pandemic burned off any residual, do what you're told kind of stuff. And,
new world after the pandemic.
Yeah, totally. And so here I am with a book opportunity. And I decided it was only worth me writing if I wrote what I believed was right for the wine world right now. So
were they sympathetic on the other side?
Well, so the
or
funny
you had
thing
to push
is,
a little.
The funny thing is, to be totally honest, I avoided the question until I was done, because I came up with this idea
that's one way to approach it.
Well, I came up with this idea that the wine history of California has been brilliantly covered by, Charles Sullivan and Thomas Finney, especially, have done an incredible amount of work ensuring that we have a thoroughgoing record of the history specifically of wine in California. But the thing for me was like these books, they tell you the narrative in the sense of, and then this happened, and then this happened. But the thing I never could find was, okay, but why did this happen? What was going on that meant this was the answer to it? Because I think sometimes we talk about wine and wine history as if it's its own distinctive thing, forgetting it only happens this way at this point, not because someone magically came up with an idea, but because people were responding to everything else going on. Wine is always happening in a moment in history,
Right.
So that was what I decided. I was like, I want to find out why this key historical moment in wine of California happened then. What else was going on? So I made this decision that the history section, I didn't want to just rewrite what had already been brilliantly covered, but instead I would take those major moments in California wine history and look at this bigger picture of like state, national, and global change.
All right, so you're enticing me because that's the stuff I want to talk about. Let me just finish the vitals part. So you started when, and it took about how long to write?
Well, I'm 50 years old. I've been telling people it took 46 years to write because it takes
But
a
I
few years
alluded
get
to
your
that
stuff
earlier.
together.
It's you carried your whole life into this.
Yeah, I just think that's how I'm built. Like the way I approach things, everything is very interconnected. Like I'll be tasting wine, and I just, that's how we started this conversation. I'll be smelling wine, but I'll be like, wow, this is like the tundra in this part of Naknek, Alaska.
Right.
The links kind of leap in for me in a way that maybe isn't typical for everyone. And so I was like, well, what would it look like if I approached the book in that kind of way, but tried to make it clear at the same time,
Right.
like easily readable.
Right. So you have the book broken down into 3 sections. We talked a little that there's extensive appendix. A lot of books have epilogues. The epilogue in this book is important. So that plays into it. Let's start. And you may have answered this a little, but you could tie it together. Just give me a brief description of the 3 sections. The first section is how we got here. That's the historical part. Second section is where we grow. You talk about regions and winemaking. The third is what we're facing, which is really, cultural and the role in future wine. I have specific questions, but just give me a brief description. I think you answered. The first part is really a historical perspective, and you talked about how you approached it, right? Anything else in there?
Well, yeah. So the history section, how we got here, is looking at the history of California wine through a much broader lens. So, there's a whole chapter on the role Vietnam played in shifting interest and perspective and expanding the number of businesses in California wine.
The Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's just one example that, it's an example of something that would be surprising for a wine book. I haven't seen a wine book that talks about
but there's
the
a handful of instances like that. Things that had an effect. But I guess if you start from the beginning, I've read a lot of books on the history of Napa, and, it talks about a lot of things that are not in this book. I don't think people realize that this wine industry was built on the backs of indigenous people. When you say that, you go, oh, yeah, probably. But I mean, that was one of the most integral things of really getting the wine business in California, right?
Yeah. So the first 100 years of wine in what's now California really was made and led by indigenous people of the area.
Who were the experts in the end.
Yeah. And one of the ways we tend to approach history, at least in the United States, is like, there's this guy and he made that change. And so in the case of California wine, Junipero Serra is who brought wine to California. And the date of the sacred expedition crossed what's now the border into San Diego. We say that's the arrival of California wine. But actually, there were maybe 2 handfuls of Franciscan monks spread through San Francisco to San Diego with different missions. And Junipero Serra was one.
Where did they come from?
From Spain. Yeah, thank you.
They were Spanish?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
Spanish Franciscan monks, so kind of central northwestern Spain. And they, Spain had settled in what they called New Spain. And so it was this area, what's now Mexico, and kind of the southwestern United States were considered New Spain. And then they crossed into what's now San Diego and slowly moved their way up as far as San Francisco. But each mission only had 1 to 3 monks, Franciscan monks leading it. So if you think about, okay, except this was in their view, an untouched landscape. Where did their food come from? How did they build the place they slept?
Right.
How did they get enough to trade with the Presidio nearby? All these things. Well, they had what they called neophytes, which were indigenous people they had brought into the mission and converted, which actually also meant they were enslaved. And so the monks did like get the initial cuttings for what we now call the mission grape from Mexico, which got it from Spain. But they, the indigenous people figured out how to plant it, how to grow it, how to irrigate, how to harvest, how to get the grapes in, and then with some guidance from the monks. But for the first 100 years of what's now California, so through New Spain, Mexico then gains independence in the 1820s, until 1850, then it's the United States, and so from the 1760s into the 1860s, it's indigenous people growing and making wine in California.
So that time period, is that, when you think California winemaking and the farming really began?
Absolutely.
Kind of that's the mark, right?
Yeah, because the thing is, we tend to think, oh, that was before. But actually, there's all these basic things about that time period that really establish the foundation of what we then continue to do. So as an example, this sounds really obvious to us now, but they decided to head train the vines. It wasn't the only option they had. There were other ways that people knew how to train vineyards.
Right.
They decided to head train the vines because they're in a new land. They needed not have to use ropes and wires, to put it simply. And so they head train, and that became, vineyards in California were head trained essentially almost the first 200 years of the region. So
describe, just so people understand, head training is like a freestanding plant.
Yeah. So a lot of vineyards, like if you go watch movies,
you see rows.
Yeah, you see rows of vines, and the canopy's sort of held up by this, again, to be a little basic,
pole and a wire.
Like a rope and wire system where the vine leaves are sort of fed between these wires that hold them up. But head trained vine, it's like you turn the vine into a little tree. A tree has a trunk, and then the branches spread out on top of the trunk, and you can train a grapevine to grow in that kind of way too. And so that it basically holds itself up.
Right.
And so that was how the first vines of California were trained, and then continued to be really until, the middle of the 1900s, essentially.
I can't remember from the book, or even what was the transition from mostly head trained, to what people perceive as rows of, what was the reason for that? Productivity, easier?
Yeah. So that was absolutely the idea was, so head trained vines, they demand a lot more attention in the beginning before they've firmed up to be tree-like, to put it simply. And then the advantage is once you get through like those first 8 years or something, they kind of take care of themselves. Like you
Right.
don't have to do as much. But but so they need a lot of attention in the beginning. And there's a way in which how many grapes they'll grow can be less predictable because of that too. And so in Prohibition, vines were still pretty much head trained, but in Prohibition, our thinking started to turn from growing grapes for wine to growing grapes to sell because home winemakers wanted to make wine. So during Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, it's illegal to sell commercial alcohol
Right.
in the United States.
Sacramental.
Yeah, and so we could only it could be made for the church, or the head of household could make up to 200 gallons in their home for their family a year. But what that meant was, to make wine, you need fruit. And
Right.
so the California wine industry turned into a grape industry. And what a lot of people don't know is, wineries almost entirely disappeared, but vineyard acreage doubled. And it was,
That's an interesting point. I picked
yeah,
up on that right away. You figure everything's gone, but
no, the vineyards,
when the
vineyards
dust
massive
settles, there's more land.
Yeah, but so in that time period, though, people are not thinking about how do we make good wine. They're thinking, how do I sell more grapes? So the thinking moves towards volume and yield, basically. And so people start rethinking what's the most efficient way to grow that costs me the least time and least money, but gives me the most fruit. And
So
so
head training to
yeah,
vine
so they
rows.
start shifting to more efficiency, to more direct rows, even if head trained, are still easier. Oh, if it's too low, my back starts to hurt. So they they
Right.
start bringing the fruit zone where the fruit grows on the grape a little higher off the ground, and then it evolves over time into if I train the canopy up along wire and everything's in a row, boom, 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 I can just go down
Right.
the row and get everything.
Are people at the stage of treatments then, or it's too early?
Well, so yes, I mean, until and through World War II, we are just basically using sulfur and some kind of home remedy type treatments. So like
Right.
people will dry milk and spray that on, or they'll make a copper solution, they'll spray that, or they'll have some kind of herbal tea and they'll spray that. But then in World War II, is this not it creates a massive change in the United States in terms of the economy and the number of people here, and our that's when we become a world leader, is because of World War II. And the at the same time, the needs that were created from such a massive war hugely advance our understanding of chemistry. And so there's all of these things that are needed to like fuel a plane and clean equipment and all this stuff. And we end up a lot of stuff we already knew about chemistry, but there was a way that we didn't need to implement them. And then in World War II, suddenly we need to implement all this information, and we start developing chemical agriculture.
Same thing happened in Europe, right?
Yeah. It's a global.
Not dissimilar.
It's a moment globally where there's this, again, chemistry and our understanding of it was already advancing, but World War II created a need to implement it, and
but so that made growing grapes easier, probably
in the
more
short
production.
term,
yeah. I mean, we know that story.
Yeah, so we have pesticides and mildew treatments and fertilizers, and those all erupt kind of after World War II.
Right. And how long? I mean, that's a show in its own. But how long till there's an awareness? And I always think that California is slower than other areas to put attention towards that. Does that go into the 80s or 90s when people realize they're poisoning themselves, or their kids are running around vineyards,
Yeah, so
crap?
it's interesting because the I said the chemical agriculture really gets established after World War II, but some of it was available already. And if you travel around the world and talk to people, there were a lot of people that pretty quickly actually realized, okay, these chemical treatments are helping me farm more easily, but my family doesn't feel well. So there were already questions like that. And then what happens is there's it's in the middle of the 1900s, it's very much like it is now, where people are not really connected to where their food comes from. You live in a city, right? So you're not walking through a farm every day.
Right.
And so there's this very basic lack of knowledge about how plants grow, and what it takes to make an apple and things like that. So in the United States, I mean, and basically the whole world, there's always this sort of group of or class of people that do the growing, and so in the United States, first it's indigenous people for the first 100 years of California, and then now they're kind of gone. And so what do? So we bring in people from China, and then from Japan, and then India, and then Mexico, right? And the immigrant people become the laborers to create our food and our wine, do the farming. And so in the 1960s, this movement takes place in California. Filipino workers, farm workers, they instigate it, and then they collaborate with Mexican and Mexican American farm workers, and they start the farm worker movement in the 1960s. Just so people know, like, this effort of agricultural workers to improve conditions and raise awareness of things like poisons in food, that had been going on since the beginning of the 1900s. And there were massive labor strikes in every industry all over the United States in the 1930s.
Wow.
And the labor strikes of the 1930s, again, across every industry, they were hugely effective and caused massive regulation changes and employee protection laws to take form in the United States. FDR responded by creating the first labor protection laws of the United States. So
that was the birth of real proper regulation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the mid-1930s.
Yeah.
But domestic workers, home workers, and agricultural workers were excluded from the 1930s protections. And so what happened is by the 1960s, farm workers there's a really shockingly high proportion of people dying really young and getting horrible cancers and illnesses, and some that we'd never seen before. So people would be ill, but we wouldn't know what it was. And so farm workers start kind of trying to gather information and start, and the healthcare workers that they're working with can see, oh my gosh, like, you were in the field as this was being sprayed, and 2 days later you're in the hospital, stuff like that. So the farm worker movement, again, Filipino agricultural workers led by Larry Itliong instigate a strike in the mid 1960s and realize that, okay, if the Filipino workers come off the farm, well, the growers will just hire the Mexican and Mexican American workers. So Larry Itliong realizes the only way change will happen is if all of the farm worker groups agree to strike. So Larry Itliong actually goes to Cesar Chavez and asks him to join the strike. Chavez says no.
Cesar Chavez was the bigger overall farm workers?
He was the one that became famous.
Right. But the people picking lettuce.
Yeah.
And, not just grapes.
Well, so Larry, that was true of the Filipino workers too. They all worked across all crops. But Larry Itliong finally talks Cesar Chavez into bringing the question of a strike to the Mexican American Farm Worker Union, and they finally agree to join. And so all of the farm workers go on strike together. It's a huge labor issue. The growers are losing money. Very quickly, Governor Reagan and President Nixon get involved. They back the growers.
Of course.
That's massive persuasive power, right? If
Sure.
the president and the governor are backing the growers, there's no way you're going to win. So the farm workers decide they need to get creative, and they end up boycotting California grapes. And over time, lettuces and different things too. But they boycott grapes. But the thing they did that was brilliant was they got a lot of help spreading this message about why people should support the boycott. And what they ended up realizing was effective was to have people in front of grocery stores all over the United States talking to the women that were buying food for their families. And so what the farm
That
workers
was brilliant.
Well, yes, because there was already an environmental movement at the time. Like Rachel Carson's book came out in 1962, this idea that pesticides are poisoning the wilderness. But that's really distant, right? Like if it's just this park over here, well, I just won't go in the park. What the farm workers did that made the nation realize the poisons were a problem was they educated housewives on the idea that what is done in the farm goes into your body when you eat the food. And so the farm worker movement was significant partially because they created a boycott and then got people in front of grocery stores all over the nation and taught them pesticides are poison. You're bringing that home to your family. So, housewives at the time, that was who provided food for their family.
Yeah, they didn't want that.
So even if they don't have a super apparently persuasive voice, if they're not buying it anymore, families are not buying those things anymore, right?
Right.
And so it starts influencing the public. People start demanding change. At the same time, the farm workers are also filing lawsuits against the government and bringing, legislative demands to the government. And so the two sides simultaneously, the public wants change, and now the government is forced to reckon with what is actually going on. And so by beginning of the 1970s, people start realizing, no, pesticides really are a problem. This chemical agriculture is a problem. And in 1972, California makes DDT and the other most severe pesticides, organophosphates, illegal to use in agriculture. And then later in 1972, the United States does.
God, that was probably the most brilliant movement, marketing, and advocacy, campaign. I mean, it was so organic and homegrown, no puns intended.
The truth is, I don't really ever see it talked about thoroughly in wine books. Like it's referenced quickly. And in my mind, it's one of the most important moments in agricultural history of the United States, but also has had an enormous impact on how we approach the wine industry now, except we tend not to recognize that's where all these changes came from.
So I was going to ask you, the last question on the point was, do you think the history of California wine has been properly told up until your book? And, you mentioned the two other guys who did a good job, but I'm telling you, there's no discussion. What's Larry's last name? How do I pronounce it?
Larry Itliong.
Right. Just in the short time we talked about it, his significance, people think of Cesar Chavez and the movement and all that. Obviously, a major figure in California agriculture and all that. So I guess I can answer the question I asked you was probably it hasn't been properly told up until this time, or not the detail or recognition. You agree?
Well, what I think is that in the United States, again, in many parts of the world, we've tended to talk about history as, again, this guy shows up and he has a great idea.
Right.
And then everybody does.
You made that point.
Yeah. And that, like Cesar Chavez, of course, is important. Of course, he's influential.
But it wasn't just the guy.
No, one person can't do all those things. The idea came from Larry Itliong. Dolores Huerta made the connection between Itliong and Chavez, convinced Chavez it was important. All these other people do the work. The Black Panther Party was they went into some of the neighborhoods that were more difficult for white people to go into, while white evangelical churches went into white neighborhoods, and together they were able to cover, all these different grocery stores all around the country, right? So who connected them to the churches? Who connected them to the Black Panthers? One guy can't do all that
Right.
stuff. And so
That's
that's the shift in perspective that I took. I was like, okay, how did Chavez become effective?
right. That's a great point. You
Yeah.
kind of work backwards.
Yeah.
And there's a big story and not one guy. I mean, that's incredible the way that's done. I want to talk about one more thing in the chapter. Then we got to take a quick break, and then I want to talk about the second and third chapter. And then you're not leaving without doing the wine list. At the end of the chapter, you talk about the arrival and effects of social media. So the major question is, how has social media changed, wine? I mean, I kind of grew up in, as a collector and a drinker, like in the Parker era. So you have a dominant personality, then the internet, and then there was still traditional media, the Wine Spectators and all that. And then blogging came around, which you talked about. Tell me how you think it changed. And I think the good thing now is it's more democratized, and no one person or thing is driving preferences like Parker did. So just give me your, a quick take on how social media, has changed wine, and you've used it for yourself and to change wine.
Yeah, it turned out, but it turned out like I have a career because social media helped me get my work out there,
Right.
So if you just think back to how we accessed information decades ago, like when I was growing up, I learned how to use a card catalog. I loved card catalogs. Seriously, but you would literally have a big cabinet in a library with all these little drawers,
Right.
and you'd have to finger through card after card after, like index card size things, just to find out if there was a topic available to study.
Right.
And then, okay, so then what books are here? And you could only access what was in that specific library. And then in terms of the news, you would have to get this paper delivery to your front door early in the morning. When I was growing up, in Anchorage, Alaska, which again, remote, but we had a morning paper and a completely different afternoon paper, because that was the only way we could get news updates, except, there would be some stuff on the radio. But then, so if you just think about that, you're waiting for other people to give you information at a pace that is only daily. And if you want a whole book on something, you can only go to what's in your area, in your library.
Right. How crazy does that sound now?
Yeah. So if
with AI and ChatGPT, right?
Yeah. But if you think of the logistics, that's an incredibly slow movement of information.
Right.
And the truth is, those newspapers were nationally interconnected, right?
Right.
The Associated Press was a news service that every newspaper in the country used to deliver stories from outside their home region. And so then what happens in the early 90s, we get AOL. Suddenly we can message within a certain network, right? And then, and then now this internet thing happens where AOL can email someone else outside of AOL.
Right.
And then suddenly there's web pages, but they're frozen. It's like this page has one block of information. Then suddenly we get links, hyperlinks. I remember when this happened, it was a huge big deal, because you'd go to this one web page that would have information about soy milk. I don't know.
Right.
And like partway down, there'd be this mention of, a farm in Illinois, and you could click, and then there's their single page of information about the farm.
Right.
So, and then that like erupts into what we think of as the internet now, this whole mass of interconnected websites and pages.
Search and all of that.
And then in 2010, social media starts. So Instagram started in late 2010. Twitter started a couple years before that.
Isn't it crazy that
Yeah.
all of these are still teenagers?
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. And but it takes years, so Twitter, when I started, in 2011 on Twitter, wine Twitter was a nice place to hang out. Like
Right.
wine people were so excited to find other wine people
Right.
that, wine Twitter, so to speak, was really supportive and positive and just charming. And then when I started on Instagram in 2011, there were just a few of us, and we were all still trying to figure out, well, what do I post besides like this bottle shot or something? So it's like, those of us that were in the game at the time, we were developing what social media even meant, like what does it mean for
Well,
wine?
it's
And so,
communication and content.
yeah, exactly. But the thing was, think about the difference, right? Like I can go to Instagram and search the word wine, and there's going to be too much content for me to access, right? Like I'll be overwhelmed. But that means I can choose whenever I want to get online and search the word wine, and there's information everywhere. And however long I want to spend following it around, I can do that. But it's all information from different individuals. So if you contrast that to waiting for the morning paper, where there probably isn't even a wine column,
Right.
and going to the local library, where if you're lucky there's one wine book, like suddenly the access we have is, oh my god, like there's no comparison really. But also the speed of access. So the difference is we don't have to wait a month until we get Parker's printed, mailed newsletter to find out what
Which,
wine
by
is.
the way, was one voice too.
One voice. Yeah, it was all him,
Yeah, I mean,
until,
you were talking peer to peer when you
yeah.
search on Twitter or Instagram, any topic.
Yeah. And yeah, now I can, God, I have a friend in the Netherlands
Right.
that I finally met in person after 12 years, who has messaged me through Instagram and been like, "Oh my gosh, I just had this wine in Spain. They're looking for an importer. Keep an eye out. You have to try this. You'd love it."
Right.
And so I do. I keep an eye out, and then I end up going to Paris and I find the bottle. I'm like, "Oh my god, this is so good." So then I message someone I know that's trying to get an import company started, and I'm like, "You have to try this wine." And then, within 6 months, it's going into the United States. They're importing it. Like that's how wine's done now.
The speed is
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
It really is unbelievable in that sense. The discovery.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, the discovery is unbelievable. Still feel that way about it? I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, at least in the category of wine, I think social media serves the category pretty well. I wouldn't say that for politics, let's say.
Well,
How do you feel?
yeah, I think for wine, it social media is really important, because again, how else do we connect with each other? There's
But I think it's good too.
no,
There's not a
absolutely.
lot of crap or negativity.
It's
It's
made it possible for more people to have a small production winery, and oddball approaches too, right?
right,
Oddball grapes or oddball winemaking styles, and then still find an audience that of
right,
people interested.
right. I think that's great. Elaine, we have to take a quick break.
Okay.
We're talking to Elaine Chukan Brown. We're talking to Elaine about her book, The Wines of California. When we come back, the big part of the book is 3 chapters. We got into the first one. I want to talk about where we grow and what we're facing. So when we come back, we'll get into that. You're listening to the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. We're back with my guest, Elaine Chukan Brown. Elaine's new book, The Wines of California, is out right now. And I want to talk to you about the book. Um, the second chapter, there's three sections, but the depth of each one of these is nuts. And maybe we scratched, maybe a little more than scratched, the first chapter. When you brought up Vietnam, it's such a specific example of how things change. There's a handful or more of things like that. So that's why people should go out and buy the book and read it. But on Where We Grow, that's the second section. It's a reference section, and it gets a little nerdy in a good way. I say that affectionately. There's all that detail and all that. There's vast info on all the wine growing regions. As kind of a guy who cut his teeth, on California wines, Napa, influenced a little by part. Why did Cab become king in California? From the times we were talking, like from the 70s, 80s on.
Yeah. Oh, I love this story. It's just fascinating. It's such a good illustration of how dependent wine is on all kinds of other things to become,
Right.
So, okay, so, I'm going to get geeky, like you said, and go back a bit. But so in the late 1800s, there's wine in Sonoma County. Sonoma County gives cuttings to Napa Valley, and they both start growing wine. At the time, though,
Was Sonoma more developed than Napa?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Sonoma started growing grapes first.
Okay.
And then a couple decades later gave grape cuttings to someone in Napa, and then they started growing it. But Sonoma literally plants vines first and then expands further first and all these things, and has more infrastructure. People with money interested in wine are in Sonoma, and later they get to Napa. So in the 1800s, though, people are taking vines. They'll just take a stick, a piece of the vine, and they'll plant it in the ground, and it'll root and grow into a grapevine, and start producing fruit. But what happens in the late 1800s, we end up getting this infestation of a louse, a little bug that carries a virus called phylloxera.
Right.
And the virus, so the bugs will bite into the roots and create little cuts in the roots, and then also feed this virus inadvertently into the vine, and the virus actually over time kills the vine. So all over the world at the end of the 1800s, people are dealing with phylloxera, and their vines are dying, and no one knows why. So there's a couple of decades of effort to try to solve this, and finally we realize, okay, wine is made from this one species of grape called Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera originates in Europe. But this other species of vine from the eastern 2/3 of the United States is immune to phylloxera because that's where phylloxera originates. So people realize, okay, if you take the root of an American vine and graft the fruiting top, the top of the European vine onto each other, the root where the phylloxera goes will be protected. And then you'll still get the European fruit to make wine. So they start doing this. And so by the 1980s, all over the world, most vines are planted in this way, where a European top is grafted to an American root system.
Right.
But we made a mistake. So in the 60s, researchers developed this particular rootstock that is like a cross between European species and American species. And they believe that it's immune to phylloxera. But a couple decades later, we find out it's not. So the 60s and 70s.
Was it not because it was sort of a blended, or that wasn't the reason?
Yes, it was partially because it was blended, but also what we didn't know was that only American vines that grow east of the Rocky Mountains are immune to phylloxera.
So it had to be 100% of that pretty much to be immune?
Because the Rocky Mountains are an enormous barrier, right? And so phylloxera didn't exist along the west coast of the United States until after we accidentally brought it over. So late 1800s, vineyards all over California are decimated by phylloxera. We figure out the grafting thing. So we replant grafted vines. And then in the 60s, this rootstock called AXR1 is developed and heavily promoted because it like gives better yields and is easier to grow than the other types of American rootstock that had been used before that. And then in the 1980s, Napa Valley discovers that there's phylloxera in a vineyard. This doesn't make any sense. They think it's an anomaly. Our vines are immune because they're grafted. It's fine. There's just happens to be phylloxera in this one vine. It's fine. By 1988, the producers in Napa Valley are forced to accept, no, there's phylloxera all through Napa Valley. But again, this doesn't make any sense because they've grafted all the vines.
Right.
They end up discovering that AXR1 is not immune to phylloxera, and it's been planted in more than 80% of vineyards throughout Napa Valley. So but again, imagine this, 1970s, wineries in California start increasing. People start investing money to have this more agrarian family lifestyle, living on the farm with their vineyards. And then by 1988, all these people that came in and invested and changed their life to have a vineyard in Napa are faced with the cost of pulling all of their vines and replanting them on a new rootstock. You can't
and then waiting however many years for the best first fruit, right?
Yeah. So think about just the sheer cost. If you have phylloxera, you can't just take the vine that got sick and plant it in a new way. You have to get an entirely new vine. So just think about the cost of replacing every vine on your vineyard. That's one thing. But now also, you had already spent all this money developing the infrastructure and planting the vines in the first place. And then maybe you only planted your vineyard in 82. It takes 3 to 5 years after you plant a vine to start getting fruit from it to make wine. So if you think about all these layers of cost, the cost of replanting over 80% of Napa Valley vineyards was, approaching $1 billion, something like that.
Wow.
And in the whole region, right? And so what happens is until the 1990s, Napa's this new region. It's kind of a baby region. Everybody's figuring out how to grow there, like what grows well where, how do we farm, what does the soil need, do we need to irrigate, all these things. And so Napa was planted like a patchwork quilt. Vine rows went in every direction. Some vineyards were head trained. Here's Chenin next to Cabernet, next to Pinot, it's all
so
mixed
there was
up.
No one playbook.
No, because you can't have a playbook until you've played the game long enough to know what rules make it work.
Fair point.
And so what happens though is in the end of the 1980s, when Napa's forced to accept it does have phylloxera and it has to replant. Thankfully, Napa had just over 100 years of wine growing experience at that point. The 100 years was why everything was planted all crazy, mixed up like a patchwork quilt. But the 100 years also meant people could choose to plant what they had learned does well. At the same time, it's so expensive to plant, you have to plant what you know does well, right? Because you've got to get your money back.
Right. You got to get it right.
Yeah. And by then, we knew Cabernet as well in Napa Valley, but we also knew people like Cabernet.
Right.
So this replanting starts, it goes over a 10-year period. And in 1997, for the first time in California history, Cabernet Sauvignon becomes the primary grape of a region, which is Napa Valley. And so people think of,
so before 97, it wasn't
before 97,
it was Chardonnay or a mixture of varietals?
No, before 97, the most planted variety in Napa Valley was Zinfandel, and the second most was Petit Syrah.
Wow.
And in 1997, finally, and the other thing about Zinfandel and Petit Syrah was that they had been planted so long ago that they were growing on the original American rootstocks, not AXR1.
Which was fine?
Yeah, the original American rootstock, St. George was kind of the main one, and that's immune to phylloxera. So the oldest vineyards in Napa Valley that still remain from before the 1980s, they're probably there because they're on St. George rootstock. But the so when people replant, they replant to an entirely new American rootstock that really is immune to phylloxera.
Right.
And Napa,
you know, get it right.
Yeah, 70 to 85% of Napa Valley is fully replanted, but with new knowledge. So it gets planted to Cabernet becoming the primary grape, but everything else changes too. Almost every vineyard is planted, trained on the rope and wire system that we mentioned earlier. Vine rows are planted to take
It looks pretty homogenous now.
Yeah, and so now when you drive through Napa, it looks like an organized system.
Rolling rows of, tightly cropped. So to my recollection, 97, you cited 97 was kind of a big bountiful vintage, and it was a pretty good vintage.
Yeah. It's a lot of people still talk about it as one of Napa's great vintages.
Yeah, the 90s were, pretty good. Tell me a couple other things in this chapter. People think of wine growing regions in California. Obviously, Napa and Sonoma come to mind. There's a few others. But you mentioned a couple of places, that I don't think people have ever heard of, that are interesting, and tell me why. Like, I'll tickle you with one, like York Mountain. I mean, I don't know much about it. You bring it up. That's an example of, some of the great regions, Sierra foothills.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is, Napa is absolutely the most famous region in California. It only makes 4% by volume of the wine from California. So
right.
where's
Lodi,
the rest of it?
Mendocino, right.
Right. So where's the rest of it? Well, it's all over the state. Lodi makes at least 30% by volume, something like that.
That much?
Yeah. Well, it's like, yes, 20 to 40%. I realize that's a big range, but the point is, compared to 4%, it's 20% is quite a bit more. But the Sierra foothills, actually, their volume is lower because it's all steep sloped mountain vineyards.
Right.
But that's part of the point too. Like, California wine is fascinating because it's so much more varied than I think it often gets credit for outside of California. And like you were saying, you grew up, so to speak, on California wine. You've been following it for a long time. You and I both know it's fascinating. Like people always ask, oh, well, where's the best region to look for to find more affordable but still good wines? Monterey is the perfect place for that, right?
Really?
The land costs are a little lower. The farming cost is a little lower. Access to water and things like that are a little
Sounds
easier.
Like the Jura or something.
And so
where there's land and
exactly. And so there's long-standing farming families. They already owned the land.
Right.
So immediately, if you already have land and all you're going to do is change it from, cherries to grapes or something like that, the cost is simply lower than if you have to buy an entirely new piece of land. Yeah. And so Monterey has an incredible range of wines, and they're pretty consistently less expensive than some.
Are newer like wineries popping up through the years?
Yeah, for sure. There's like the Scheid family. They've been there for generations.
Scheid?
Yeah, exactly. They've been there for generations, make great and also affordable wine. There's a lot of little, Ian Brand, a lot of his wines come from there. He's gotten really popular in the last 10 years. But there's also a lot of smaller brands from the North Coast, Napa and Sonoma, who source fruit from Monterey or other parts of the Central Coast. And so that's one of the things we're seeing far, far more now than we would have like 20 years ago, just as an example. You'll have a winery in the sense that there's someone producing wine under a specific winery name, but they probably don't have their own vineyard. Instead, they buy a little fruit from San Benito County and a little fruit from Santa Barbara County. So those are two very different parts of the Central Coast. And a little fruit from the Sierra foothills and then some from Mendocino. And that becomes their portfolio, is sort of this collection of wines from their
Right.
favorite vineyards in different parts of the state. That's a lot more common now.
Right. Like the grower movement in Champagne, are a
Yeah.
lot of these growers going to eventually move, or some of them, to making their own wine under their own name? Do you think that'll
Yeah.
be a
Yeah.
trend?
Yeah. So, you mentioned Lodi earlier. Lodi's history is very much a grower's history. Like
Right.
the vineyards there were owned by multi-generational families. And for a long time, they sold all their fruit to Gallo, who then used it to make, Hardy
Right.
Burgundy or whatever. And then Almaden comes in and starts making wine, and Sutter Home starts making, White Zinfandel. But the history was, these large companies would go to Lodi to buy all of the fruit from this family. But what happened then in the 90s, the whole wine business is shifting. Almaden ends up dissolving like in the early 2000s,
Right.
and White Zinfandel is not as popular. These growers need to find other options, essentially. So very end of the 90s, you start seeing fifth and sixth generation grower families launch their own winery, and you
There it
see
is.
that. Yeah, so you see that in Monterey as well, other parts of the state that have this long-standing multi-generational farming tradition, but they only ever sold their fruit. You start seeing, essentially grower wineries opening up around the state.
Um, the other thing is, we talked about how Cab came king. One of the things that I know, experienced, and see is the proliferation of, more varietals, newer varietals. You take a guy like our buddy Dan Petrowski, he's growing
Yeah,
only white Italian varietals,
yeah,
in Napa. So there's a good deal of the two things going on: more
yeah,
varietals. And people do, Randall Graham has been erroneous for God knows how long,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, no, I totally think so. Because again, we were talking about social media and how it's opened up our access to information and our ability to get recommendations from each other instead of just from one authority that mails a newsletter once a month. And and on the other side, that's also meant opening the way to different kinds of wines and different varieties that are not as well known, because now you can have a winery that, if it connects to the right person on social media and that person shares it with enough people, that this
It's
winery might,
crazy.
they
Yeah.
might only make 100 cases of Cab
Yeah.
Pfeffer, but it's sold out because on
Right.
social media they found the Cab Pfeffer lovers.
We talked about social media. There's another example, of its, total effect, kind of, in a modern sense,
Yeah.
how social media works, newer winemaker, newer stuff. That's amazing. I want to talk about the third chapter. Now, you and I could do a show. So part 3 really, it gets into where we're going and what we're facing in wine. You discuss significant changes, cultural changes in the wine market that confront us. And, I think that's a really important chapter. And again, your voice and your knowledge and all of that. You and I could sit here and do an entire show on climate change. So I'm going to push that aside. What I've been curious about, because, I've been sitting, I asked Raj Parr, what concerns you now? And, he talks about generational change and consumption, and you get into that. So give me your take on that, your discussion of generational change
Yeah, so
and its effect.
there's a couple of things. It's been, for 10 or 15 years or something, we've been getting wine articles about,
Yeah.
young people aren't drinking
I-
wine.
I'm
And
going to the gym, I
yeah,
don't
and well,
drink.
and like Fit Vine was released in like 2016 or something. This whole brand where there's like images of people working out on a bottle of Chardonnay. Like, it's super weird, but that is really where public interest went to, like, how do I get healthy so I look better well, reduce your calories. Well, this wine's low calorie, stuff like that. And so there's a couple things there. One is that what I find fascinating is the wine industry often, or at least it used to talk about these things as if it was the young people's fault. Something's wrong with them that they're not drinking like this anymore.
Right.
When it's like, this eventually thankfully spurred on questions about, well, what is the wine industry doing to reach new generations? So we're grappling with that now. But I think too, if you look back at how the popularity of wine grew in the United States, when, so-called baby boomers were coming up, wine was the only nice option. Like, into the 80s, what we had for beer was, mass produced like Rainier. And a lot of the other beers we could actually buy in the United States were of that type, where it's like mass produced, always tastes the same. Like it's simple. And so if you wanted a sophisticated beverage, well, wine was the option. So then, by the time Gen X is growing up, craft beer has come out. You can start exploring beer in a way analogous to how you explore wine, because craft beer, there's smaller production in comparison. This one's from Germany, that one's from Belgium.
There's a story there.
Yeah, there's a story. The styles are different.
Right.
And so people start exploring beer. But now think about it. That means Gen X has two options, right? There's wine, but there's also beer. And if you look at people from Gen X, they're still drinking beer all the time,
Right.
But then by the time you get to millennials, there's been this craft cocktail boom.
Mixology.
Right? Yeah, but now none of it's canned yet. You've got to go to a person to make your cocktail.
Right.
But they just harvested white basil that morning from the leeward side of the blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And now the whole cocktail's designed around that. So cocktails suddenly are fascinating. Again, like in each case, it's like, where's the complexity and interest? So millennials now grow up with three options. Wine is only one of them. But then by now, we call them zillennials. It's like the young side of millennials and the drinking side of Gen Z. By the time zillennials are coming up, you've got canned cocktails, even more niche specific beers, flavored wine, and then now most recently we have all these non-alcoholic options that are still interesting to drink.
Big category.
So if you just think logistics of the market, of course, young people are not drinking as much wine because, you and I are both curious people. Honest to God, like I said, I was just in Vietnam. I went through Japan on the way back, just briefly. In Japan, there is this drink that is like milky white. And most of, if you're in Japan, of course, the label is in Japanese, except there's one big word called sweat. Just like it sounds, SWEAT, sweat. I bought that damn thing because I was like, what the hell is a drink called sweat?
Is it like a sake or a soshu? Or
no, it's a non-alcoholic water alternative. It turns out it's a mix of sugar and salt. It's like this funny version of electrolyte drink.
Right. It's bad tasting Gatorade or a different
but a really salty, sweet Gatorade. But the point is, what is sweat? I want to know.
Right.
I didn't drink it after I tasted it, but I had to know what it was. If you just think about that kind of mindset, for boomers, I have to know means Cabernet from Bordeaux versus from California. Right. For Gen X, it's like, oh my God, what's the difference between Belgian and Irish beer? Millennials, whoa, what does it mean if I have this whiskey versus that bourbon? And now zillennials, it's my God, what is a drink called sweat? It literally, I went to a Japanese market 2 days ago on purpose to see
if they had
what drink. I wanted to know, okay, I saw these drinks in Japan, which ones are available here? And they had a huge section of sweat.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You know,
So
though, it's crazy.
yeah.
But
So I want to, if something's really weird and I don't know what it is, I want to try it. And of course, not everyone is as curious as that. But even if you're just casually buying things,
But I think your point is, when you laid everything out, the bourbons and the wine, and
yeah,
that's why
yeah,
consumption and the generational change is affecting wine.
yeah,
Definitely in that sense. Do you think I don't I think I've read this. I think it's supported that natural wines, thoughtful farming, organics, biodynamics, are their consumption rates are not down as much as other stuff. And I think maybe, and react to this, maybe that generation is more into the story, more into the farming, more into, smaller. You think that's a case or?
yeah. No, absolutely. So just as an example, like 8 to 10 years ago, these news stories broke about a producer in southern Italy using vineyard laborers who it turned out were being held in the country illegally by by someone else, some vineyard manager. But the point being, people were being exploited to make this wine.
Yeah, I
As soon as
remember
that
that
story
story.
broke,
Well-known names.
as soon as that story broke, the importer quit bringing that
That's
wine
right.
in because no one in the States would drink it. That is a great example of how broad the interest going into wine is. You don't just buy something because it tastes good or because this is a
Right.
prestigious brand.
We kind of started the show on that premise.
Yeah,
It's not what's just in the glass.
yeah, exactly. People want to believe in what they buy now.
That's I think that continues. The last thing I want to talk to you about on the chapter, and then I want to take into the wine list, and then I got to get you out of here, is my perception, and nobody better than you in doing the podcast and going from kind of a dopey, knowledgeable, open-minded wine guy to somebody who's been swayed to the good of all of this. My sense in talking to everybody from everywhere that when you look at California, more Napa, Sonoma, because I know Lodi may defy that, they're slower towards sustainability, organics, regenerative farming, all of that. Is that accurate? I mean, I know you're going to say, no, no, wait, this guy's doing it that, but are they where they should be, or at least moving there?
The thing I will say is that Napa Valley, especially, has, no rain in summer, which means it's drier.
So none of that mildew,
Yeah,
moldy.
except for a couple of parts of Napa, like for example, the southernmost part, really close to the bay. There is significant mildew, which means disease pressure there. The rest of Napa Valley is relatively dry in terms of humidity in the air, which means less or no mildew pressure. And so that's one thing.
So that's
But
being dealt a good hand.
yes, exactly. The very center of the valley along the river, the water table's high. Okay, so that affects the quality of the wine. But a lot of the rest of the valley, it's really good free draining soils or shallow soils. So you naturally get like concentration. You might have to worry about vine stress or something. But the point is, I could keep listing all the ways that, like you just said, Napa's been dealt a good hand. Napa Valley has the potential in terms of growing conditions to become even either a mostly or an entirely organic region. Like Napa has what it needs to succeed at that.
I get that. Is the
Yeah.
desire and a commitment there?
Yeah, so there are, of course, some people doing that. Anytime you travel anywhere in the world, there will be somebody that says, "Oh, but we can't do that here because blah blah blah,
Right.
disease pressure or something." I know producers and growers in the southernmost parts of Napa that where everyone says you can't do it there over by the bay. I know producers that are doing it there and they're
Right.
doing it beautifully. So if you have someone thoroughly committed to problem solving, they figure it out. So my point is just that, okay, Napa is not entirely organic, but it has more of most of what you need than most regions in the world to be able to do that. So imagine if Napa Valley, one of the most famous wine regions of the world that has incredible capital and investment behind it, that it like literally is known worldwide. Imagine if a region like that committed to even 80% organic production. You know, even if
Listen,
there's a few growers that aren't. The
my
point is,
question is more, are they committed? Is that going to happen? You're in the weeds. I mean, are you hesitant to say, listen, here's all of that, but to me it feels like it's slow going.
yeah, I mean, I think you're right. To cut to the chase, I think you're right. I think there are some exactly like you said, there's producers that are doing an incredible job. There's growers that in some of the toughest parts of Napa to grow organically are beautifully pulling it off.
Right.
All the solutions needed are there, but the proportion of people doing it is still modest.
So we can only hope that that changes and the market pulls them that way.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is it comes down to what we were talking about a minute ago, is what's going to convince consumers to spend that money on wine? Well, they want to believe in it.
Right. Good point. We'll leave the chapter there. There's deep discussion about climate change, which is an important issue to you, an important issue overall. And like I said, a really good discussion. The technology in wine that's available is, very interesting. There's a good discussion of that, and, kind of the cultural changes too. So again, I hope I piqued people's interest and they go, I got to get this book and read more about that. All right. Couple of last quick questions. I remember I asked Pascaline this with her book because it seemed like it was the right question.
Well, and I love Pascaline and her book, and go out and get that one.
Yeah, but I said to her, is it okay to jump around chapters in her book, or do you need to read it cover to cover? With your book, I'm not sure the answer. Is it okay?
Well, yeah, I think it is. The thing that people have said to me is that they've said that it's a compelling read, that it's the way I wrote it is surprising and a page turner, and yet it's also really useful. And I think people have been surprised to have both things in one book, just based on the feedback I've been getting.
Totally agree with that. But to my question, let me ask you this, because I just thought of it. If for some stupid reason I read chapter 3 first, does that throw off how you presented the book or the flow?
No, I don't think so.
Because if I went to chapter 2, it's all regions and everything. Yeah. It's a different perspective than 3 or 1.
No, I think you can read this section that that you're most interested in, and there are the 3 sections: how we got here, where we grow, what we're facing. I think you could read them in the order you want.
Right. I would recommend, because I think the way it's put together and set up, I would recommend. But people don't always adhere to.
Yeah, and that's okay. If you don't care about history, you want to know where we're going. Well, then read section 3.
Yeah. All right. So we got to end it somewhere, and we're going to end it there. And I want you to do the wine list, and I want you to be spontaneous.
Okay.
I don't want you to dwell.
Okay.
I post these on social media. If people have sat with us and listened to this interview, and I ask you questions, I think they would die to know your take on your wine preferences. So that's why we do it, and we post it on social media. So 5 questions. I've asked the same 5 questions to everybody, for the last 8+ years, over 300. So here's the first question. What are you drinking now? What's in the fridge? Are you forced to drink something for a project? Do the seasons change and, you switch from heavier reds to whites? What are you drinking now?
Yeah, I'm definitely drinking whites and sparkling wines.
Okay, not just champagne, all sparkling.
No, yeah, I'm I'm always drinking champagne, but I'm lucky to have access to sparkling wine from all over the world. And I've
So
been
give me, you could give me some specific sparklers. You could give me producer or not, but is it like Cremant? Is it Prosecco? Or, what are we talking?
one of the things I've been doing recently is spending more and more time trying to understand cava. And a lot of what we think of for cava in the United States is like really inexpensive
I
cava,
know
and there
exactly what you mean,
absolutely
right?
is that. But there's incredible cava, and if you look at a wine label and on the back you see the grape name Xarello,
Right.
XEREL-LO. You
That's going to
see the
be
grape
good
name
cava.
Xarello as the primary grape in that sparkling wine, get that wine. I am so in love with Xarello. You can find still white wines of it too, but it's got this celery salt freshness
Really?
to it that I just can't get enough of. Macabeo is the other really predominant variety in traditional cava, and it's more about round fruit and a little bit of floral lift, and it's beautiful. But my thing is Xarello for sure, and there's other varieties. Perlata is the kind of the third but less common one, and that's more
Right.
really herbal. Um, but Xarello, if you see Xarello on a
Run
wine
to it.
label, get that wine.
Now, so you said cava, you said whites. Get a little more specific. What type of whites?
I really like high acid whites with texture. So
Can I
it's
just say something?
yeah.
And this is not, I'm not mocking you. You're like the 50th person who said high acid whites because
Yeah.
those are the best whites.
No, they are. They absolutely are. Because like other whites with lower acid, it's just a different version of what you get from
Tedious.
red wine.
Yeah, not good with food, tedious.
Yeah.
So what's a good example of that? Either varietal, maker, region?
Well, you mentioned Masakan, Dan Petrosky's Masakan. It's
Right.
that, if you're talking California, you can find that and it's good.
Yeah. Good example.
Yeah.
Good example. And I like to support Dan. Second question, goofiest on the list. Elaine's favorite wine and food pairing. Not what you and I would agree is the ultimate pairing, but what's yours? And obviously it's something you probably don't eat, a lot, but you remember it to be a good pairing that you enjoy. Do you have one?
Yeah, so a friend of mine was staying with me last week and made mushroom risotto. And I realized I had this bottle of 2001 Premier Cru Burgundy. So this is still pretty highbrow, but it's one I had recently, and I was like, oh my God, like Pinot has become so prevalent that I think it's easy to think, oh yeah, Pinot. But the truth is, when Pinot has this reputation of being so desirable for a reason. And when you find a good Pinot, it's just enthralling. That's why so many people, their wine
Well,
origin
yeah.
story is Burgundy. So yeah, so like let's go to the peak. I had this 2001 Premier Cru Burgundy. It was still like bright and beautiful, but had some of that like mushroomy age, and
I
then
was
to
going to
having
say
mushroom risotto. Oh my God.
the a little aged Pinot
Yeah.
with the headiness, the muskiness of mushrooms. I mean, it's like wine and food. So
Yeah.
that's a good one. All right, third question. The question is, recommend to me some of your favorite wine restaurants and or bars. And it's not, you're not singling people out, you're not ranking it, but I always say, like, if somebody asked me that, I'd say Chambers, and here's why. The wine list is off the charts, the vibe is unbelievable, the food is unbelievable, the people are unbelievable, they just do it right. Can you think of places, and not just restaurants, could be wine bars, either locally or in your travels, where
Yeah.
you've
So the funny thing is, when you started to ask this question, the first place I thought was Chambers.
so we're
Pascaline,
going to put Chambers down.
yeah, we
Happy to do.
absolutely got to put Chambers on there. Pascaline, and just did a wine dinner for me in the book.
I
And it was
saw I was out
incredible.
of town.
It was fantastic. And then, here in Sonoma, you've got to go to Valley Bar and Bottle. Fantastic people, really great food. Not, it's like just delicious food. You feel good after you eat it. And
Nice.
it's also not typical. They source from local purveyors, local farmers, which is always good. The other place, though, if you want something quirky just to hang out, just a block away from Valley here in Sonoma is DOS Wine Bar. It's a wine and cider bar.
I don't think anybody's ever mentioned that one.
Yeah, Dose. And there's 5 or 6 owners that all make either wine or cider, and all their stuff is there, but they're also great at hosting events, and you can have a glass of wine or whatever.
Cool.
And it's quirky stuff that's like casual, easy, good,
So Elaine, the reason I ask this is people hear that and they go, wow, that sounds really cool. And the next time they're there, they go to it and it usually lives up to the hype.
Well, so let me mention one more.
Go ahead.
Okay. Like I said, I was just in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, pretty easy to get to spot. My friend V has a wine bar. It's this tiny little super smart place, and people say it's the first natural wine bar in Vietnam. Everything available there you can get by the glass. There's snacks too. It's tiny, but
what's it called?
Yeah, so it's NOB. It's a natural. Oh my gosh! Now that I'm talking about it, I can't think of it. It's the corner bar, a natural wine corner.
Natural wine corner.
Yeah, and it's in Ho Chi Minh City, and or NOB. You could look it up. So like if you look up NOB natural wine Ho Chi Minh.
So I will give you the distinction that in my tenure doing this, nobody's ever recommended that place. Okay. So kudos to you. Yeah. And I'll put money down on the table that it ain't coming up soon either. So that's as good as it gets. All right. 4th question. The question is favorite all-time wine. Take that off the table. When I first put the question together, I wanted to know, Elaine, what was the rarest, most expensive wine you ever tasted? Don't care about that.
Yeah.
I actually asked Aldo Sohm. I tell the story all the time, the same question. He goes, that's the dumbest question. Why would he ask me that? I'm around this stuff all the time. Why don't you ask me what changed my life? So the question morphed into, what's that wine that, is still important to you today, that changed the way you thought about wine, maybe I could answer, and I don't want to, but maybe that Chianti, that may have been a gateway, which is part of the answer too. But in that vein, can you think of a wine or two that really still resonates?
No, absolutely. So 2008 Irie Still Red Pinot Meunier was
that the one you mentioned before?
Yeah, it's the wine that ruined my life.
Was it 100% Meunier?
Yeah, 100% red Meunier.
Do they still make something like that?
Yeah, it's a little different now.
Is it blended at all?
No. So it's still 100% Meunier. There's no new oak, which I think with Meunier is crucially important. It's also a naturally high acid region, which is crucially important. Meunier's become more popular, so it's growing in more places. But if it's too warm, too ripe, or has new oak, you lose what, in my mind, is the beauty and subtlety of Pinot Meunier. So you've got to find a producer that does no new oak. Honestly, no new oak. And doesn't, keep some firmness of fruit, so to speak. The other one I would highly recommend is Best's Great Western from Victoria, Australia. So I got to have a 1966 Best's Great Western Pinot Meunier from vines planted in the 1860s on their own roots.
Jesus.
That wine and the 2008 Irie Pinot Meunier, the Irie was made from the first Pinot Meunier vines ever planted in Willamette Valley in the mid 1960s.
Wow.
So the funny thing is the vine age is about 100 years apart, but that Irie, now he's got more Pinot Meunier planted in younger vines, but at the time it was only the original vines. And it just blew my mind, because for me, wine, if you can find a wine that has detail and clarity without heaviness, like
Right.
where it's like you can't help but get enthralled, and yet it's almost like it floats.
Right. That's
Oh my God,
that's a tricky art, man.
yeah, that's
You know.
life-changing wine in my mind. And
Yeah.
that Irie was the first time I had a wine that did that I couldn't get over. And
That
literally that's why I walked away from my academic career. I had to understand, what is this? How did this happen? Is
so
this what
that
wine is like?
that's how you answer that question. When somebody says I walked away from my career because
Yeah.
of that wine, that's how you answer that question. All right, last question. The question is best wine around 15, 20, 22 bucks. I need you to recommend a red. I need a white. You could do maker, you could do region, you could do, like I always say, Muscadet from the right producer is just a great value white. So give me something, on those lines that you could
Yeah.
think of. And this is a selfish question because, my kids are a little more grown now, but when they were sort of, starting to buy wine and going to parties and gifts, it's like, Dad, how do I get good wine for cheap? I said, well, let me ask my guest. So what do you recommend as the best value red and white, 15 to 22, 25 bucks?
Well, so I love red wine, but again, I want it to have some lift to it. So I really, I've been lucky enough to be spending more time on wines from northeastern Spain.
Yes.
There you go. Incredible sparkling cava, and fantastic textural racy whites, and flavorful but still uh, wine with an open weave, I like to say. Reds. Northeastern Spain, my God,
Wait, Penedes. So when you said whites, you mentioned
Yeah,
Xarello,
Zarello, I
Macabeo,
really love it.
those varietals we're talking. So
Yeah,
red, the region is Penedes, right?
yeah, but so
What are
yeah,
some of the grapes or
yeah. Well,
wines?
so you can get Garnacha there. That's fantastic.
One of the great
Yeah,
varietals.
absolutely. And it comes from Spain. It's just that northeastern band. There's still that kind of warmth for flavor, but then it has a lot of it has that ocean exposure that keeps it fresh. And then but also it's the home of cava. Cava has expanded beyond Penedès now, but like that's really where it starts. And the so traditional cava, meaning with the original grapes, would again Xarello, Macabeo, and Perlata. But there's also, you can use Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and then for rosés, Garnacha. And so you can get a whole range. There's cavas that are made with Chardonnay and Pinot that are absolutely incredible, but they're cava. They're not Champagne or Franciacorta.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
really love that part. There's always this almost, for me, that part of the world, there's this almost salty palate stimulation
Right. They
that
do it
is
well.
so satisfying to me, because again, it like freshens up your mouth. Like what wine is satisfying and energizing?
Right.
There's a lot
That's
from Spain.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say Spain's underrated, but I think people don't think Spain has the region's diversity,
Oh my God.
that France, and Italy
No,
have.
no.
And by talking about it, we stimulate people's interests. I
Yeah.
mean, then you could just go over to the Canary Islands. It's like a
Yeah. Oh my
whole,
God. Yeah.
different. All right, so terrific job. As I mentioned, I will post those so people have the specifics. We have to do a quick wrap up, and then I want to get some info. So just hang in for a second. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Listen to the Grape Nation podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your pods. Please subscribe to the Grape Nation and leave a review if you like the podcast. If you like the podcast, subscribe. If you subscribe, you wake up and there's Elaine next to you ready to talk to you with her new podcast. Follow us on Instagram at SBenRuby, on X at BenRuby, 2 different handles, but you can always use the hashtag the Grape Nation to find us on both. We're on Facebook at the Grape Nation. As I mentioned, we'll post Elaine's wine list picks, some really good ones there. And let's not skirt the fact that some of her recommendations are from Northeast Spain, where she's spending a lot of time digging deep into all of that. And finally, Elaine, where would we tell people the best place to purchase the book?
Okay, well, so it's always best to go to your local bookstore and ask them for it.
Yep. And it's distributed at local bookstores.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there definitely are local bookstores that you could walk in and find it, but also just give them a call and say, hey, could you order this?
Right. Don't forget that. They'll order it for you in 2 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. Like here in Napa Book Mine has a great website. You could just order it that way, and then they'll tell you when it's in. You walk in and get it, or they'll send it to you. But then in this case, it's a very small publisher that has done an incredible job making the book available. And so that when you have a small publisher, buying directly from them is also a really great thing to do. And so Académie de Vin, VIN, Académie de Vin Library, they, Academy,
on their site.
Yeah, Academy, except with an IE instead of a Y. Yeah, if you go to their website.
D-U-V-I, Academy, I-E, D-U-Vin.
Yeah, VIN. Library. Yeah. And so if you go to their website, if you just search Wines of California, Chukan, or some part of my name, then it'll come up. And if you go to Académie de Vin, that, and they'll send it directly to you. It's a really great thing to do. It supports a small business, a publisher, and then, or your local bookstore.
Okay. On social media, if we want to follow you. And so I do, which is how I track where the hell you are, who you're talking to, what you're talking about. So if other people want to, how do they do that? Where do they go?
I'm mainly on Instagram at this point, and it's Hawk Waka Waka. So Hawk _ WAKA.
Now, I don't know if I ever asked you, what was the origin of that?
So when I started drawing and writing about wine, I still had an academic career. And I didn't really know how my writing about wine would look in that context. So I decided, I'll just keep them separate, and I'll just do my wine stuff under a different name. And so I needed a nom de plume, as they say, an author's pen name. And I was like, well, crap, if I'm going to make up a name, I want to make up a good one. So I decided I wanted a name that, if you didn't know me, there was no direct association at all. If you knew me and you heard it, immediately you would be like, oh my God, that has to be Elaine. But also I wanted it to have gravitas and be ridiculous at the same time. And so
Jesus, I didn't expect that answer.
Oh, come on. I
thought you were going to say it's a derivation of my indigenous people, of the Inupiaq people, and it signifies none of that, right?
No, not at all. I wanted the name to have gravitas and be ridiculous.
All right.
As soon as I came up with that list of requirements, the second I finished it, the name came out. Lily Elaine Hawk Waka Waka.
Right.
And then I shortened it for Instagram to Hawk Waka Waka.
Right. Does that go back to when we talked about when you started the blog, which Asimov and all those guys picked up? That's when you needed a name for all of that?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So when I started in wine, I was Hawk Waka Waka, and that's all anybody knew me as. And then, like by 2015 or something, Elaine Chukan Brown started being known in wine, and so people knew both. And now it's like, only people that have been around for a while know Hawk Waka Waka, and because I've been publishing under Elaine Chukan Brown. So
so that's Hawk _ Waka Waka, right?
Yeah, WAK.
All right, that's where you can find Elaine on social media. I recommend, because of what we talked about, how I described her in the beginning. She's somebody that, is interesting to follow, has a lot to say, important things to say. All right, so I want to thank our guest, Elaine Chukan Brown, for joining us to talk about her new book, The Wines of California. As always, I want to thank our engineer, Armin, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam Ben Ruby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.